This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
On a recent commentary on MSNBC, political scientist Melissa Harris Perry urged us all to remember the name Trayvon Martin. Today on Left of Black, we will remember Trayvon Martin and talk about the tragedy surrounding his death, as we're joined by Professor LaRue Lewis, a professor of sociology and black studies at the City University of New York, and we're also joined from Chicago by Mary Morten, consultant of the Mary Morten Group and the producer of the new film Woke Up Black, which examines the lives of black youth. And later we're joined by Professor Ercia Edwards, Duke PhD, and the author of the brand new book, Charisma, The Fictions of Black Leadership. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined this afternoon by Professor R. LaRue Lewis, professor of sociology and black studies at the City University of New York, where he does work on educational inequities and also work on black masculinity. And we're joined from Chicago by Mary Morten, who is the president of the Mary Morten Group, a Chicago-based consultant firm, and producer of the new documentary Woke Up Black, which examines the lives of black teens. Thank you both for joining us. I wanted to have you come on Left of Black to talk about the tragedy and controversy over the recent killing of Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old African-American male who was killed by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch captain in a community outside of Orlando, Florida. Let me begin with you, Mary. One of the dynamics of the story is that particularly the mainstream press has spent a great amount of time imagining what George Zimmerman might have saw when he saw 17-year-old Trayvon walking past him in his neighborhood. Very little focus has been placed on what Trayvon may have been experiencing as this 17-year-old male also trying to navigate the world. Talk a little bit, based on the research that you did for your film and the interviews and folks that you talk about, the experiences of being a black teenager in the United States and trying to figure out your way in a world that it very often is very antagonistic towards you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. It's great to be with you on Left of Black. And we gathered interviews from from 25 young people in New Orleans, in San Francisco, and in Chicago. And in all but one interview, every young person told me that they had some sort of negative interaction with the police. And so you start right there. They understand how to navigate in the world. They have been schooled, if you will, on sort of what to do when they are pulled over, when they are talked to by the police. And all of the youth, no matter what their economic background, where they came from, what their family situation was like, they had these experiences in common. And many of the youth realized that they are the victims of stereotypes, just as one of the young people said in the story regarding Trayvon Martin, that he knows that when people see a young black youth, particularly an African-American male, that there are many stereotypes that come to mind. And that is really where the title of the film comes from. One young man in Bayview, San Francisco, indicated that he didn't drink, he didn't do drugs, he was in school part-time, but that he was treated the same way all of his friends who do those things are. He was treated in that manner by the police. He was always, he was being stopped on a regular basis, and he didn't understand it. And at the end he said, "I guess I just woke up black." So clearly, these youth know that they are being racially profiled and that they're being targeted first and foremost because of the color of their skin.
Thank you, Mary. Professor Lewis, you wrote a very eloquent and touching piece in ebony.com talking about just trying to process this. And I imagine, like you, like myself, that you weren't surprised at all that this had occurred. I mean, this at some point is kind of par for the course for the life of African-American men. Talk a little bit about the dynamics of this, particularly in relationship to how the larger society, in particular, visualizes black men, and particularly young black men.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Mark. I think that
Like you and many others, I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed and saddened again when Trayvon Martin's life was taken. We know that from year to year, whether it's Trayvon Martin, Oscar Grant, Yusef Hawkins, that we see black men in American society and globally visualized as a danger, right? And that's often from folks across the spectrum. Many of the images that people carry about young black men they're dangerous. They don't have values. They could be associated with violence at any given moment. And in reality, when you actually talk to young black people, like Ms. Morton's already demonstrated, they tell you, hey, I'm just trying to live my life. Yeah, right. I'm trying to be a young person who finds a way around this society, finds safety, finds my calling. And at any moment, despite all individual responsibility, despite all good home parenting, despite a belief that they are somebody, they are profiled by systematic injustice. Someone can look and say, he's a danger. And in the case of Trayvon Martin, we see this happen again, where a young man who's just living his life has his life taken because of the fear of others, the paranoia around blackness and around black males.
One of the things that's been interesting about this, as folks try, because I think in American society, when these kinds of tragedies occurs, when these kinds of events occur, we want to be able to find a singular face of evil. You know, we want to be able to say that, you know, George Zimmerman did this because he is a racist. Or we want to disprove that he might be a racist to say, okay, it was just an accident, it was just a misunderstanding. We feel sorry for the Martin family and we mourn Trayvon's loss, but this is nothing significant. Talk a little bit about, and this is for either you, Professor Lewis, or Ms. Morten, how it's not really about the racist antics of one individual figure, but the way that race factors in how we understand who black men and black males are. You know, this is really about a systematic attempt, you know, to position black men in a certain kind of way and black males in a certain kind of way, that regardless of who they are, what their background is, what their educational attainment is, they're always criminalized. They're always already seen as a threat, you know, someone who has to be pursued and incarcerated, and in this case, exterminated.
I absolutely agree with that comment. When I first started working on the film and asked many designers of many different races to give me some mock-ups for visuals, I said, I'm making a film about black youth, and that's all I said. Every person came back with only images of young black men.
With hoodies, right?
Exactly. And I just thought, I was so taken aback by that. Here I am, you know, an African-American woman making a film. Nonetheless, everyone came back with images of black men, and I had to really push them to, and then when they came back with additional images, it was of young black women who in some cases were pregnant. I mean, it was a very interesting kind of exercise to go through, but I think you're absolutely right. Many of the young men in my film have talked about, you know, playing in the alley with a basketball hoop right above them, but having the police roll right up on them and put them in the back of the car because of some curfew that they've broken. And only when someone can say, my father's a state's attorney, and that's who I'd like to call, right, where they can bring in some authority, right, were they given some different kind of treatment. But we know for thousands of youths, right, that does not happen. And these are the youth that are falling through the cracks and that are constantly trying to prove themselves when actually they're not doing anything wrong to begin with.
Right. You know, one of the things I want to, you know, bring up to you, Professor Lewis, and this is a conversation that, you know, we've had for a while now. You know, you do work, and I could bring up somebody like Mark Lamont Hill and Jelani Cobb, and a bunch of us who do this work talking about black male privilege. And in fact have taken a lot of heat, Byron Hurt, you know, for talking about this. And in some ways, you know, folks who are critical of talking about black male privilege will use examples like Trayvon Martin, right? What kind of privilege does he have if he's taken out in this kind of very quick and brutal kind of way? Talk a little bit about trying to find that balance, to talk about the way that, yes, black men are obviously targeted in the larger society, right? And for every Trayvon Martin, there are literally hundreds of these men that are never going to generate any kind of, you know, focus on social media or mainstream corporate media. But at the same time, talking about how we talk to young boys about behavior that ultimately is detrimental to not only them, but also their communities, right? How do we do that both and?
Right. I think it starts from a place of love, recognizing that black males are connected to a larger society that devalues them. that sees them as dangerous, but also put sometimes their experience at the center. As Mary Morten said, I'm doing a film on black youth, and it was all zoomed in on the black men.
Right.
Black women become accessories, right? And if they're accessories, they become problems, right? Either they're sexualized or they're pregnant and something's going terribly wrong. In reality, we have to deal with the ways in which black men face a larger society that devalues them and how that devaluation they revisit on their sisters, on their mothers, on their lovers. The reality is, if we want the safety and security of black men, we've got to talk about how to deal with the police, but also talk about how we deal with the women in our life. Currently, there's a large movement to work against street harassment.
Right.
The idea of talking to young men about what you do when you're in groups with other men. Sometimes young brothers will sit on a stoop and they'll catcall women. They'll call women by their body parts. They'll act aggressively towards women because they're in the company of other young men. And they're compromising the safety of young women and not increasing their own safety. When we're looking at what it would take to have a safe community, we know one of the major reasons that police end up in our communities are intimate partner violence calls and domestic violence calls. Right. If you want to liberate the hood, if you want black men to be safe, we've got to deal with our relationship to women and the dangers we put them in, and also how we can be trained to heal as a community. Not just demand justice for a killing, but justice for a community where everyone can be safe, where everyone can be accountable, and everyone can be healthy.
What do we say to those parents, and I'll use the Martin parents as an example here, Trayvon's parents as an example. You know, we know what the murder rate can look like in Chicago on any given weekend. We know what the murder rate can look like in some place like New York City. We know what police profiling looks like in a city like New York City or a city like Chicago. And so we have those parents who work their damnedest to be able to get their children out of environments in which they face violence on an everyday basis, right? That they can't control. I think about the young man that was killed in Chicago outside of his school just last year. Yes, what do we say to those parents who put in the work and raise their children in a kind of way, make all the right decisions, and their kids are making all the right decisions, and what happens is they still have to deal with random violence because of the bodies that they're in?
I would say the first thing we have to acknowledge is many of the parents who have lost children, the first thing they say is that I want this to stop, not so my child can come back, so that other children can live freely and safely. We have a lot of conversations about what we need to do when interacting with police, but we also have to collectively demand a different type of policing. We have to collectively demand, if folks are acting in vigilante ways, that they get prosecuted, that they get brought to a court of justice where things can be dealt with. Instead, what often happens is we take a momentary flash, right? We take the tragic moment when someone loses their life and say, all right, we're fighting for this person, but don't connect all the dots. That means mama and daddy, granddaddy, grandma, brother, sister, and even those who just may see it pop up on your Facebook or Twitter feed have to stand together and say, this violence that is falling upon black boys and girls is unacceptable. How can we create a safe community? Number one, through communication, not just between us, but also with these offices, with these officers, with these politicians, and demand that they do something to change the training and the response around these incidents. I will not forget when Sean Bell was killed, people demanded a justice investigation. Before the investigation came back, President Obama made the statement, look, now y'all just don't act up. We can't have an assumption of black violence and black criminality. We have to challenge across the board. So if you're white, I'm going to challenge you. If you're black, I'm going to challenge you. But we have to challenge with love and say, look, these are our children. And if we'll do something now, we'll lose more and more.
Yeah, and this feeling that, you know, we have a president that's almost more interested in his NCAA brackets and the political implications of that, as opposed to actually saying something of substance around this. And yeah, I think we're all happy that the Justice Department is going to get involved, but I think we also were expecting something more than just political leadership. For you, Mary, what has been the response to your film thus far, both amongst kind of general folks who get a chance to see the film, but also young folks who've had the chance to see the film thus far?
Well, I have to say that it has been overwhelmingly positive. We've had screenings, you know, in various parts of the country. We haven't been to New York City, though. We'd love to come there. And we've had a number of people in some situations stand up and tell their own stories about what's happened to them growing up, about how they're so happy to see some positive stories, because at the end of the day, these youth are going to make it. These are stories that you generally don't see because we get 20-second sound bites on the news. And as one young man says in the film, often we're concentrating on how someone died, not how they lived. To your point earlier, that we've been talking about Zimmerman much more so than Trayvon and the life that we've lost. And so it's been overwhelmingly positive. And one close friend actually said to me, he said, you know, I think you really picked exceptional youth. And that's why everyone has responded so well to your film. And my response was, I do believe these youth are exceptional, but they're not exceptions. There are far more stories like the ones in this film, but we don't hear about them. Because when you lift up these kinds of stories, they don't fit the pathology. They don't fit the stereotypes that people want to have about Black youth. I've had young women tell me when they've left the film that I'm so happy I had a chance to see it because now I realize I don't have to be in a video or play sports to be successful. I had an adult organizer at the University of Chicago say that I know that I'm homophobic. I understand that I need to deal with my homophobia. And one of the young women in the film does identify as lesbian and genderqueer. And you see this heartbreaking story that the situation she's having with her parents. She's an A student on scholarship at University of Wisconsin in Madison, but her family will not accept her and has rejected her. And she is broken about that, but still determined. And so at the end of the day, what I learned and what I saw is that these youth are resilient. And so what I think we have to do, we've got to start including them in the conversations.
Absolutely.
Where else, you know, not in the Black community, the women's community, the gay community, would we think about setting policies and, you know, putting laws into place and not have the group of people that are impacted the most in the room? So youth have to be part of the conversation.
Well, let's hope with the death of Trayvon that, you know, all of us will be inspired to really take this conversation to another level, both in terms of dealing with a more broader perspective on what our youth look like, particularly young Black men, but also, you know, to be able to really push forward and inspire those Black youth, you know, who weren't going to be in really fortunate situations like a Trayvon and so many other Black kids. I mean, the reality is that for all the attention that we get for Trayvon, you know, there are going to be hundreds of 17-year-old Black boys killed by other 17-year-old Black boys that are never going to rate this kind of attention. And we need to be as vigilant in dealing with their lives, you know, as we are dealing with, you know, Trayvon's tragedy and the aftermath of his death. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor R. LaRue Lewis, who is a professor of sociology and Black studies at the City College of New York, where he does work on educational inequities and on Black masculinity. And we've also been joined in Chicago by Mary Morten, who's the president of the Mary Morten Group, the Chicago-based consultant firm, and producer of the new documentary, Woke Up Black, which examines the lives of Black teens. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon on Left of Black.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Outside that same city, the celebratory atmosphere would change quickly. Who watching the game with me? You know Lil Trayvon was repping his hometown, D-Wade and LeBron. He had just came up from Miami to see a daddy who knew such a great weekend would end badly in a place where you move because it's safe for your family. But some people got an ingrown hate for your family. Halftime, just a short break from the slamming. About to go to the store, little cuz, you want some candy? Bet I'll grab you some Skittles, kid. I'll be right back in a little bit. I said I'll grab you some Skittles, kid. I'll probably be right back in a little bit. Human beings in a mob. What's a mob to a king? What's a king to a god? What's a god to a non-believer who don't believe in anything? Will we make it out alive? Cousin Skittles and an iced tea. Walked out the store and felt the chill of the that was watching them, clocking them, thinking about stopping them, 9 milli cocking them. Who's this nigga walking through my neighborhood? He fits all the specifics of criminal statistics. He looks suspicious. 911, push your emergency. A black man walking through my hood purposely. Stay calm, it's just little Trayvon, but he wanna be the hero, so he put his cape on. George Zimmerman, neighborhood block captain, loaded Glock strapped in, fake cop has been. Got out the car, ignoring what the cops asked him. They always get away, this time that will not happen.
Human beings in a mob. What's a mob to a king? What's a king to a god? What's a god to a non-believer who don't believe in anything? We make it out alive. Alright, alright. Shut you wild.
George Zimmerman didn't take his Ritalin, drunk off adrenaline since he's making the citizens arrest. Trayvon looks at him vexed. I just walked to the store, nothing more, nothing less. Just steps from his home, he ignores his request. George grabs him, Trayvon swings and connects. Starts screaming out for help, but Zimmerman sees a threat, so he pulls out his gun and he points it at his chest. He fires, but he misses. Trayvon pleads for forgiveness. I didn't do nothing, this is senseless. But George Zimmerman was so vicious, he made sure the second shot hit him. No survivor, no witness. Trayvon never gave his cousins his Skittles. Mr. All-Star Game didn't see another dribble, and George Zimmerman wasn't even arrested. The message is only white life is protected in America.
Welcome to Left to Black. My name is Anthony Neal. I am your host, and we are joined from the University of California at Riverside by Professor Ercia Edwards, author of the new book, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership. That's the University of Minnesota Press, a homecoming of sorts for a Duke PhD. How are you doing today, Professor Edwards?
I'm wonderful. It's good to virtually visit the Franklin Center. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited about talking about this book because I can remember this book when it was almost in its infant stage, and being very excited about what the end product was going to look like then. Talk a little bit about your inspiration for this idea of the fictions of Black leadership, and the way that charisma kind of informs what we think of leadership in that context.
Sure. So as you know, this project started as a dissertation project there at Duke, where I was working with Juanima Lubiano and Maurice Wallace, but also working with folks like Charles Payne, and really trying to think about, this book really started at the sort of transitional moment for public ideas of Black politics, right? Yeah. So the end of the 90s, the sort of beginning of the new millennium, and really trying to make sense of, in my mind, the kind of discourse of the leadership void. So it started as an inquiry into, why it was that, in spite of overwhelming historical evidence that history has been made by, ordinary folks like you and me getting together and deciding to create change, right, we continue to sort of tell ourselves the story or the fiction that we need charismatic leaders to sort of make history for historical progress, et cetera. So
you talk about this idea of the charismatic scenario, right? Really a rupture, in this fiction about the role of charisma and this kind of single notion of a single leader. And you start this off, you jump off really as Erykah Badu at the Millions More March in 2005. Talk a little bit about that moment for folks who don't remember, the significance of that and what she really achieved at that moment. Around a coming together that was framed 10 years earlier around the lack of female voices and the lack of a female presence.
Right. So the book opens with me sort of visiting this scene of political performance in 2005, which is in the immediate wake of Hurricane Katrina. Right. So really trying to think about, and around Hurricane Katrina, if you remember, we saw this sort of resurgence of a very kind of 90s leadership discourse about this sort of post-civil rights longing for lack of Black leadership. Yeah. And so what's interesting is that Badu does something really sort of astounding in that performance, which is to sort of stop what she's expected to do, which is to
sing
her song "Time's a Wasting." So, you know, she'll tell the MC or the sort of sound system to stop, and she'll really try to deliver her own sort of political exhortation, really in the shadow of, you know, someone like Farrakhan, right, whose event it really was.
Right.
So, you know, what's interesting to me, or what I really try to get at in that introduction to the book, is like all of the sort of searching and the silences and the long pauses in the speech, or that which is sort of longing to be a speech, right? And really trying to think about the work of sort of searching for a new vocabulary for Black politics.
Right.
And so there's something really interesting happening in that moment, in which Badu is really trying to search for the terms in which to imagine a new anti-racist politics that's not sort of narrowly confined to an image of charismatic Black leadership, but herself still really you know, honoring a long tradition of charismatic leadership. So for me, that sort of scene of wrestling with that history of charismatic Black leadership, but longing for a new political language or vocabulary, for me is sort of the kind of very analog for the work of the book, right? Really trying to think about the history of charismatic Black leadership alongside a history of authors, critics, and other kind of cultural producers really longing for a different kind of political language.
And there's so many aspects of that opening performance that, you know, that are almost comical, right? You know, they can't wait to get her off the stage, right? They can't figure out what to do with it, right? Don't know what she's going to say, right? I mean, they're really concerned here, right? I mean, she's created this kind of rupture and this kind of seamless notion of what the march and celebration was supposed to be, and of course also Farrakhan's leadership within the context of that. We're here with Professor Ercia Edwards, Professor of English at the University of California at Riverside, talking about her new book, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership. That's the University of Minnesota Press. Talk a little bit about, in the context of your research, you know, the investment that we have in Black communities about this idea of a single solitary leader, almost always already a male solitary leader.
Right. So I try to sort of locate the history of cultural imaginings around charismatic Black leadership in that sort of shift into what I will call throughout the book Black political modernity, basically the end of slavery and the beginning of Reconstruction, and really trying to think about the real failure of Reconstruction as a moment that really solidified a certain kind of longing for the work that singular Black leadership could do, which was actually really important, right? So the work of the charismatic leader was both to sort of perform a certain kind of notion of racial progress in the wake of real vicious white supremacy, right?
And also respectability, right?
Of course, right, of course. But what's interesting about the charismatic leader is that he can both sort of perform a kind of secularist poise or respectability or literacy, as well as, I think, in many ways, is the only figure who can safely perform a kind of emotional or erotic excess, right? Or that which is in excess of secular modernity, right? So in a certain sense, the charismatic leader becomes a locus of both respectability, political decorum, and a sort of locus of that sort of excess of sort of Black radical sort of freedom dreams, right? So in that way, I think the charismatic leader becomes a sort of central figuration of Black political modernity at a really important moment in history in which Black collectives both exceeded charismatic leadership, but really needed charismatic leadership, right, to sort of mediate between sort of Black collectives and the sort of, you know, viciously white supremacist state.
I mean, you think about someone like Harriet Tubman within that context. I mean, not so much in that kind of performance as the orator, but literally in her function as someone who could navigate those different kinds of spaces. Part of what you suggest in the book, and we're talking with Professor Ercia Edwards about her new book, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, University of Minnesota Press. But you suggested, you know, that these investments in charismatic leadership does not come without significant implications, particularly a kind of violence that occurs with our investment in charismatic leadership. Talk a little bit about the dynamics, if you will, of that violence.
Right. So part of the work of the book is to sort of caution against a romantic investment in charismatic leadership or charismatic authority. And I try to think of that the sort of cautionary tale of the book as really focusing on three sort of violences or three forms of violence. One being a kind of basic sort of social violence, or really thinking about how, or critiquing how invested we are in a fundamentally sort of anti-democratic notion of political hierarchy. So for someone like Max Weber, who was really the sort of social theorist who really set up sort of leadership studies of charisma over the 20th century, he would sort of define charisma as a structure of authority in which we sort of willingly defer our authority to someone who we believe to be gifted with a privileged connection to the divine, right? And so when I started this project, I was really trying to think about like how violent that sort of structure of sociality really is, or how dangerous it is for an egalitarian or radical kind of democracy. So there's that. There's also the sort of problem of you know, I call this an epistemological problem of sort of really imagining our freedom through a structure of politics that reinscribes over and over again certain kinds of gender and sexual activities, right? So it's sort of basic feminist critique of a model of charismatic leadership that has almost always really overinvested in either singular male leaders or has made even female leaders fit within a kind of masculinist frame of politics. So
give a couple examples of that.
Well, think of how often we think of Tubman as a female Moses, right? So as a quick example, right?
Or someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? We give her masculine attributes, right?
Right. Which is also reflects the ways that, you know, Black women's power has often either been sort of demonized as hypermasculine or dismissed as non-normative in other ways, right? And so then the last and perhaps maybe most the sort of last violence that I discussed perhaps the most in the book is a kind of historiographical violence, or the way that our sort of notion of charisma covers over a history of radical organizing or everyday sort of political
Folks get silenced,
Right. So there's a kind of social historian or social historicist kind of preoccupation in the book with really sort of moving beyond the dominant or master narratives of the Black freedom struggle to sort of radical alternatives that we could sort of uncover operating within sort of Black political or Black social movement history.
And I think about the most classic example of that, at least in modern Black history, the way that Ella Joe Baker and Bayard Rustin, right? Bayard Rustin, we just celebrated the anniversary of his death. How those two figures have been largely marginalized. Like, I mean, there's still Black folks who have
recently, I mean, so I think for me, this work really sort of came to life in a moment in which throughout Black studies, we were really starting to think seriously about sort of everyday political labor and different kinds of models of political organizing vis-a-vis someone like Barbara Ransby's book on Ella Baker, or Charles Payne's book on the Mississippi movement. So there was a certain kind of moment in which it became possible or sort of entered the universe of Black studies to really think against this sort of model of charismatic leadership, right?
We're here with Professor Ercia Edwards, who is a professor of English at the University of California at Riverside, talking about her new book, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership. That's a new publication by the University of Minnesota Press, and new like it dropped like a week ago or something along those lines. So we feel privileged to have your new baby literally here with us. I'm feeling as though this is probably like the first interview that you have about this wonderful book. One of the things that you talk about is an aesthetics of Black political modernity, and someone I think about immediately, going back to the 1920s and Marcus Garvey, the idea of the parade and the pageant and this kind of romanticism around Black political leadership. Talk about how this aesthetic quality of Black leadership, makes the idea of these charismatic figures even that more alluring, if you will, for Black folks. Right.
So when I'm trying to think about the sort of new Negro Renaissance moment of the 1920s and early 1930s as particularly sort of formative for a kind of aesthetics of Black political modernity, or a kind of a way in which we came to really idealize the sort of appearance of Black singular male leadership. And so following someone like Hazel Carby and sort of what she does in her 1998 Race Men, I try to think about it, a sort of particularly modern or modernist anxiety about sort of alienation and fragmentation, and how the charismatic leader comes in to sort of fill a certain kind of void, or is imagined as the answer to a kind of modern alienation, right? So what's interesting is that the charismatic leader comes to be defined in that moment, the 1920s and 1930s, as both, as I'll say in the book, sort of present absence and absent presence, or as both spectacular absence and spectacular void. So there's this, you know, really interesting moment during Garvey's detention in the Atlanta penitentiary, in which the UNIA really sort of acts out, for me, what is will become absolutely formative of Black politics throughout the 20th century, which is this sort of both sort of longing for the leadership that we lack, right? So
or the leadership that's been removed.
Right. So you get this moment in which one of the members of the UNIA gives a speech in which he sort of gazes upon the empty robe of Marcus Garvey, which is positioned on stage, right? And he'll say something like, you know, whenever I gaze upon the robe, you know, it carries my mind back to when I, you know, first entered the UNIA. And what I've learned is that as long as we keep our eyes fixed on the leader, right, as he's looking at the empty robe, right, as long as we keep our eyes fixed on the leader, we cannot fail, right? So there's this real sort of conjurational work that I think we'll sort of see performed over and over again throughout the 20th century, is sort of dependence upon leadership precisely as lack or as absence, right?
And part of what you argue is that what we've seen definitely in the post-civil rights era, but clearly since the 1990s, that this notion of lack of leadership, or leadership lack, if you will, you know, is a default position for how we understand Black political leadership at this point in time. And it makes me think in particular, to throw kind of a reference to you, the response that folks had to Manning Barable's memoir, biography of Malcolm X, right? This revisionist history that many folks thought of Malcolm's life, but itself was this kind of romanticization of who Malcolm X was as a model for this notion of charismatic leadership.
Right. So the question becomes, for me, like in all the reactions to Marable's book, the question was whether people were reacting to what they sort of imagined to be the real life history of Malcolm X, or were they responding to all of these sort of stories that we've told ourselves about Malcolm since the 60s, particularly through something like Spike Lee's movie, right? So what was a story that we were telling ourselves about Malcolm, and how did Marable's book really sort of disrupt those very fictions, right? But I do think that there's a way in which that kind of mourning for 1960s leadership has really sort of structured, you know, in both sort of promising or productive, and then in also unproductive ways, all of sort of Black political, what I call Black political post-modernity, or these sort of moments since the 60s, right?
We're here with Ercia Edwards and talking about her new book, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership. That's the University of Minnesota Press. In the last section of the book, you talk about popular culture, and particularly these kind of texts that attempt to respond to this kind of lack of leadership that exists, you know, in the Black imagination. Barbershop, of course, being a great example of it, both the films, but also the work of Paul Beatty in both, I think, White Boys Shuffle, obviously, but also the follow-up to that book is also an attempt to really think about this idea of lack of leadership and reimagining Black leadership within the Black community. Talk a little bit about particularly Beatty's work in the context of this discussion.
Sure. So it's interesting that, you know, the White Boys Shuffle is really the novel that, you know, really inspired this work in a lot of ways. This is, of course, the novel about, 1996 novel about this poet and basketball player who becomes so famous that people sort of proclaim him, you know, the sort of new Black leader, right? Yeah. And so he'll begin the book saying that, you know, he has filled the perennial void in Black leadership, and then we'll only sort of go on to sort of lead us to our sort of mass suicide, right? So in many ways, this, you know, Beatty's satire of Black leadership and the very discourse of Black leadership that, as you note, he'll sort of continue in his 2000 Tough, right? Really, for me, speaks to a sort of generational shift in thinking about leadership that we see resurface over and over again, not only in sort of high fiction, but also in popular culture throughout the post-civil rights era, right? So in sort of Chappelle Show skits, in the Boondocks, right? We'll see this sort of continual sort of play with the public discourse of Black leadership, or play with our very expectations of what we think Black leadership is for, what it does for us, right? So, you know, in trying to think about the way that humor functions, particularly in this sort of complex of mourning and melancholy, or sort of hand-wringing about all the leaders that we have lacked since the 60s, I think it becomes a sort of a site of meditation for me for really thinking about, or trying to wrap my mind around, this sort of what you will call a post-soul generation, right?
What's next for you, Ercia?
Well, I'm working on a book right now on African American literature after 9/11, really trying to think about these sort of the making of Black complicity with forms of anti-terror or policing or surveillance, and trying to think about what that means for how we read or how we understand African American literature in this post 9/11 moment, right? So really sort of pushing forward my concerns with public articulations of Black politics or Black identity, and sort of what it has meant for the history of African American literature. So we'll see.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Ercia R. Edwards. She is a professor of English at the University of California at Riverside. She's the author of the new book, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, that is published by the University of Minnesota Press. A Duke PhD, having a digital homecoming, if you will. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Ercia.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.